As Ukraine burns, Gaza suffers, and tensions continue to escalate in the Red Sea and the Taiwan Strait, a near-forgotten plateau of conflict has suddenly returned to America's agenda: Tibet. Tibet, an independent nation till China's Mao Zedong's communists sent an army to annex it in 1950, using the dubious excuse that Tibet had been part of China since ancient times, a claim which Tibetans led by the Venerable Dalai Lama vehemently oppose. This week, American lawmakers passed a Tibet policy bill. What this bill essentially does is challenge Chinese disinformation on Tibet. We start off with the basics here. This is the bill. It's called the Promoting a Resolution to the Tibet-China Dispute Act. Now have a look at what this bill says. Number one, the claims made by China and the Chinese Communist Party that Tibet has been a part of China since ancient times are historically inaccurate. Number two, the bill asserts that Chinese communists are attempting to destroy Tibet's Buddhism and Buddhist culture, that Chinese policies are systematically suppressing the ability of the Tibetans to preserve their religion, culture, language, history, way of life, and environment. Number three, China has not engaged in meaningful dialogue with the Dalai Lama, and hence it is failing to meet the expectations of the United States. The Dalai Lama, then just 24 years old, managed to flee brutal Chinese oppression against him and Buddhist lamas in Lhasa, barely managed to save his life, and sought and got asylum in 1959. Number four, the bill asks American diplomats to counter disinformation about Tibet. This makes it incumbent upon American diplomats to work actively against China on the Tibet issue in all their missions. And this includes countering disinformation on the people of Tibet. The history of Tibet, Tibetan institutions, including the institution of the Dalai Lama, who is the highest spiritual leader in Tibet, and also the head of Tibetan Buddhism. So this is what the bill states. The American government must demand by the law of the land to insist on a dialogue between the Dalai Lama and the Chinese authorities, which, by the way, has not happened since 2010. Now, it's not a question of whether America will succeed. What is extremely important here is that American diplomats must put Tibet back on the agenda. China believes that it has buried the conflict over Tibet, that it has been forgotten by the world, and indeed, it seemed so. That amnesia is over. So let's just look at the bigger picture here. Let's look at the vital details buried in the fine print. The International Tibet Movement for Freedom from China has got a major boost. The Dalai Lama, who lives in Dharamshala and is the mentor of a government that looks after the interests of Tibetans driven from their homeland, has got a new spur. China condemns the Dalai Lama in the worst abusive language regularly. America has sent a signal, basically, that it is ready to be a friend of the Tibetans again. This reopens a flashpoint. This bill was tabled by a Democratic senator from Oregon. His name is Jeff Merkley. Both the houses of the Congress have now passed the bill. What happens next? Before we answer that, let's quickly go back in history. Tibetans have never accepted that they are part of China. Chinese troops massacred Tibetans in 1959 when they conquered Lhasa. This was a year after the proclamation of the People's Republic of China. Mao Zedong said that the so-called liberation of Tibet was his top priority when no Tibetan wanted to be liberated by the Chinese. This conquest was codenamed Chamdo by the Chinese armed forces in 1950. And since then, Tibet has been suppressed as a colony of China. This operation, like I said, was codenamed Chamdo. The PLA crossed the Jinsha, or the Yangtze River, and it entered Kham in the early hours of October 7. Tibet had a small, ill-equipped army. It was no match to the PLA's might. By October 19, the town of Chamdo had fallen. 3,000 Tibetans were made prisoners. The defeated governor of Chamdo was forced to go to the 24-year-old Dalai Lama with a proposal to accept the annexation. The Dalai Lama refused, with the Chinese army at their throat, with guns killing unarmed civilians at random. Tibetans did not have a chance or a real choice. The Chinese assured the Tibetans that the latter's culture and religion would be protected. This has not happened. The Chinese destroyed Buddhist monasteries. They imposed their communist system on Buddhist schools. In short, China started turning Tibet into a replica of communist China. And this fueled resistance, which erupted full scale in the year 1959 in Lhasa. Defenseless Lhasa was shelled. The Dalai Lama fled Lhasa, and as he was being escorted to Tawang in India's Arunachal Pradesh, the young Dalai Lama publicly asserted that he was Tibet's sole legitimate representative and that the Chinese were usurpers and invaders. Around that time, Dwight Eisenhower was serving his second term as the president of the US. America decided to help the Tibet resistance movement, and this obviously had to be done covertly. I have with me a very interesting telegram that was sent from the US Embassy in India to the US Department of State ahead of Eisenhower's December 1959 visit to India. Let me read out some portions for you. I'm quoting. I have informed Foreign Secretary Dutt that we had received informal request for interview Dalai Lama with President from former's New Delhi office. Dutt replied that he thought it would be most unfortunate if the Dalai Lama should attempt to see the President. Efforts as suggested to keep the interview entirely private without press fanfare would be impossible to achieve. A controversial matter would be injected into the President's goodwill visit, which is being so warmly welcomed. As such, as the governments and people of India, it would cast cloud on the whole visit. It would heighten suspicion of Chicoms and add fuel to their charge, which Dutt characterized as insulting. That the government of India was being pressured by the US government to encourage Tibetan resistance. Eisenhower did not meet the Dalai Lama in India, but America continued to support the Tibetans. The resistance was active for over 20 years, spanning across the administrations of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson. It was an unequal conflict, although the 14th Dalai Lama's elder brother, Gyalo Thondup, led the resistance. In 1969, Richard Nixon became the president of the US. Nixon wanted to improve ties with China, and he abandoned the Tibetan resistance at the advice of his NSA, Henry Kissinger. Kissinger was treated by the Chinese as their lifelong friend. For Tibetans, it was a second betrayal. In the year 1972, Nixon visited China. The price was paid by Tibet. The resistance faltered and then came to an end. We are now in 2024, 5 decades since that historic visit. What really is America's Tibet policy? Let's look at what the US Department of State has to say. I'm reading from this document here. The US recognizes the Tibetan Autonomous Region and Tibetan Autonomous Prefectures and counties in other provinces to be part of the People's Republic of China. Now look at what the bill that American lawmakers have passed says. The US government has never taken the position that Tibet was a part of China since ancient times. Basically, it is back to square one. The US, you see, is reopening a front. It is challenging Chinese narrative on Tibet. Washington is basically telling China that Tibet is not Beijing's internal matter. It is a story of suppression. It is a story of human rights abuse, perhaps also of illegal occupation. What happens next is anybody's guess. To stay up to speed with the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.